Welcome, everybody, to this panel. We are delighted to have you with us for this panel that focuses on polarization. What does it mean for science communication and decision making? I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I stand is the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, but I know that many of you are tuning in from other traditional territories. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that. So welcome to this session that is really focusing in on the issue of polarization. We hear so much about polarization, and we really wanted to structure a session that would pick this topic apart a little bit, notably through the lens of science communication and policy decision making. Polarization is on the rise globally. It has the potential to challenge societal mobilization that's needed to meet the grand challenges of our time, whether that's climate change, energy security, global health, you name it. So the question then becomes, how polarized are we? And what are the issues on which we are polarized? So we're actually going to begin this session with a poll of all of you participants. So you should be receiving a question directly to you. And the question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how polarized do you believe Canadians are? Where 1 means not at all polarized, 10 means extremely polarized. And we'll be interested to see what people's answers are, and certainly be interested to hear your perspectives on the issues as we move through the panel. So as you're responding to that and we're waiting for the results, we're going to carry forward here with introduction of the session. So what we're really interested in with this panel is, how can decision makers, the scientific community, and science communicators chart a path forward when citizens and leaders disagree, sometimes strongly and sometimes irreconcilably? What are some of the tactics, approaches, and strategies that work? So we've brought together a number of experts, a number of political leaders, Indigenous leaders, nonprofit leaders from Canada and the United States to tackle these important questions. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of information and research from the work that we've done at the ISSP, the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, on this topic, and then we'll move directly into our remarks from our speakers, who will be presenting in the following order. We have Rhonda Moore with us, who is the practice lead in science and innovation at the Institute on Governance, who's been doing some fascinating work on the topic of polarization. We have also with us Preston Manning, who's the founder and only leader of the Reform Party of Canada, a federal political party that evolved into today's Conservative Party of Canada. Preston, as many of you know, believes firmly in strengthening the relationship between science and political communities and is a regular attendee at CSPC. So we're just delighted to have him with us today. We also have Niilo Edwards, who is Executive Director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, an amazing organization that I've come to become more familiar with over the last few years that does a tremendous amount of work in terms of capacity building for Indigenous communities, First Nations communities here in Canada. I also, in preparation for this session, found out that Niilo studied public administration and applied ethics at the University of Ottawa, so did not realize, Niilo, we had that connection. Delighted to learn of that. And then our final speaker, who I think has not, unfortunately, yet been able to join us due to some technical difficulties, but hopefully she will very shortly, is Rachel Bitecofer, who is an internationally recognized election forecaster and pro-democracy researcher. She's the host of the Election Whisperer. If you are an American politics junkie, that is the podcast for you. And most recently, she's been an advisor to the Lincoln Project, which many of you are probably familiar with, given its role in the latest U.S. presidential election. So each of our speakers is going to speak for a brief amount of time, deliver some opening remarks. We'll then move into a moderated discussion, and following that, we'll open it up to Q&A. So we're really looking forward to your questions today. Let's see how we did on the poll. Do we have results yet? I'm going to maybe have to ask our technical support here. Do we have yet results from the poll that can be shared? Or are we still waiting on results on that? Oh, so you can see here the results. I'm actually having a bit of a hard time seeing them here, so hopefully others are able to see that clearly. It looks like people are not thinking that Canadians are highly polarized. It looks like they're thinking that folks are maybe moderately polarized. So let's see what we get in terms of perspectives from our various panelists. So without further ado, we'll move into the session. As I noted, I'm going to be sharing very briefly with you some recent research that we've been undertaking at the Institute for Science, Society and Policy on polarization. Just going to draw your attention to a few key concepts, and then we'll move right into our panelists. So if we could have the presentation shown, please. So the work that we've been doing around polarization focuses in on the energy and climate space. And we've been doing this specifically through an initiative that some of you might be familiar with called Positive Energy, which focuses on how to strengthen public confidence in energy decision making, notably in the context of climate change. Our research agenda includes a really strong focus on polarization, given the growing concerns about polarization over these issues in Canada. One of our key questions, though, has been, are Canadians actually polarized over energy and climate issues? How polarized are they? So this is the key thing I want folks to take away here today. We undertook a polarization survey last fall. I'll leave you to have a quick read here of the methodology. But what we did walking into this survey was to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be polarized? And we developed in essence, sort of a three-part conceptual framework or concepts to understand this, where we made the distinction between polarized opinion. This is opinions that are very strongly held on either end of a spectrum. So, people don't just agree or disagree on the issues. They don't just disagree on the issues, but they do so strongly. So if you ask a question, whether people strongly disagree or strongly agree with a statement, polarized opinion, as is shown in the image here, sees those opinions clustering on either side of the spectrum. This is in contrast to what appears below that image, where we find opinions can also be in agreement. There are many issues on energy and climate where Canadians do agree and the opinions cluster towards one end or the other of the spectrum. And then the third concept that we developed is what we call fragmented opinion. So this is where, yes, Canadians disagree on the issues, but they don't necessarily disagree strongly. We wouldn't categorize those disagreements as polarized. They're more fragmented across the different opinion categories. Now, I'm not going to have time today to go into all of our findings. I'm actually going to skip ahead in the presentation and just sort of get to the key meat here. And if anybody's interested in having a look at this presentation, the full presentation, don't hesitate to be in touch. But what we found is that predominantly, when it comes to key energy and climate issues in Canada, whether it's pipelines or carbon taxes or the future of oil and gas, take your pick of some of the more controversial issues, predominantly Canadians' opinions on these issues actually are fragmented. They're less prone to be polarized. And why is that important? Well, that's actually really important because if opinions are fragmented, they are more open to compromise. They're less crystallized, they're less hardened. It means that people are more amenable to compromise and to changing their views. So from our perspective, this was a really important finding. What we did see in terms of polarized opinion, though, quite systematically, is polarization on key energy and climate issues along partisan political lines. So that if you split Canadians up in terms of which political parties they're affiliated with, there we begin to see much more in the way of polarized opinions. And from our perspective, again, that's a really important finding because it suggests that it might be really important to have cross-partisan consensus on these issues for political leaders across parties to reach across those partisan lines. So that's the one key thing I wanted to present. Second key thing, and then I'm going to give it over to our panelists. So I'm going to be skipping ahead here so that we can move forward expeditiously. The other thing that we researched in our work is, what about energy and climate leaders? Whether those are political leaders or leaders from industry or ENGOs, Indigenous leaders, what about their views? So we undertook a study to get a better understanding of where leaders fall on these issues. And what was fascinating about this, from our perspective in terms of the findings, is that what we found is that many energy and environmental leaders fell into either sort of one of two, what we refer to as realities, basically different worldviews, thinking about Canada's energy future in an age of climate change and what transition means for Canada. And these realities, and you can read them for yourselves here, but these realities really differed in terms of their scope of change when it comes to Canada's energy systems and the pace of change. And again, for us, this is really important because one of the things that we've observed in our research and engagement is that, many leaders fall into kind of lean towards one or the other of these two realities, and often then are actually talking past one another rather than having discussions and debates and exchanges that lead toward productive paths forward. And I think what I'm going to do, given in the interest of time, is I'm actually going to end on this slide very briefly. So the work that we've done around polarization suggests that there's actually some room for optimism. That Canadians on many of the big energy and climate issues often are in agreement. And if they're in disagreement, they tend more towards fragmented opinions than polarized opinions. That said, there is much to be done here. This is not, these are not simple issues to resolve. They're complex issues to resolve. Opinions are often polarized along partisan lines, sometimes ideological lines as well. And we have, within energy and environmental leaders, these different worldviews where it's going to be really important to think through how do we start to build some bridges between those two realities as we've referred to them. So there's definitely, there's urgency to act, absolutely, when it comes to this grand challenge of energy and climate change, but meaningful progress forward in an environment where we need to think about political fragmentation and polarization. There really are no silver bullets. It's going to mean a variety of different mechanisms and tools and approaches are going to need to be put in place. And I'll be happy to get into those more as we get to the discussion session. So for now, it gives me great pleasure to begin to hand the stage, so to speak, over to our various panelists. Our first panelist for today is Rhonda Moore. Rhonda, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks today.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you, Monica and Brendan, for inviting me to be on the panel. This morning, I'm going to tell you about a research project that the Institute on Governance launched a year ago and share findings with you that will be released in a paper on the IOG website later this week. If you'd like a copy of the paper, please get in touch. Happy to share that with you. And so I'll just say that a year ago, the IOG launched a project called Driving Dialogue and Debate on Divisive Issues. And in that project, we examined polarizing discourse on 4 topics: on asylum seekers, the environment and the economy, on Western alienation, and then we had a wrap-up session where we discussed the polarized Canadian electorate more broadly. In each session, we examined the narrative driving the debate and attempted to understand it with the input of academics studying those policy issues at the heart of the debate. Each discussion was followed by a learning session where we brought participants along the analytical process with us and applied that back to public policy making. and analysis. In the next few minutes, I'll present highlights of our work and discuss the process-oriented recommendations for how we might adjust the conduct of 3 stages of the policy process in order to minimize polarization in public policy discourse. So we began first by defining and dissecting this concept of a narrative. And a narrative is a popular communications tool. We understand the power of the story to convey an idea or a concept, and narratives are often a communications tool that we use in science communication as well. And so we wondered if narrative could be a tool that can help us in the policy realm. And also briefly, I'll just say that we define narrative as the case we make or the story we tell to give context to a situation. A narrative contains values, facts, and emotion. So in our first session, we used the example of immigration and asylum seekers to explain narrative. We conducted an analysis of popular media on the subject, and we found words like queue jumpers and loopholes. These words illustrate how narrative can evoke emotion, can play on our values, and can be constructed to unite people who share those emotions and values. Narratives can be polarizing and divisive, as we illustrated in this case. And as scientists and as policy analysts, we operate pretty comfortably in a world of facts and data. But what happens when we operate exclusively in that realm? In our second debate, we delved into the relationship between facts, emotions, and values. We used the debate between the environment and the economy, really what our moderator said is a debate between climate change and the oil and gas sector, to illustrate this conversation. Since the end of the Second World War, science has held a privileged place in many countries, including Canada. We live in what we might call a science-based society. Yet, it's important to recognize that science is one input among many. Scientific information must be considered alongside economic, social, political, legal, and other types of information and knowledge. And at the root of the tension between the environment and the economy, we find a question of priorities, where on one hand, we have people who prioritize the economy over the environment, and on the other side, vice versa. And these priorities are driven by personal values. So we describe, or we might want to consider, this nesting of facts, values, and emotions like the image of an iceberg. So we know that when we see a photograph of an iceberg, or if we're lucky enough to see one in real life, that we see about 10% of the mass of the object above the water and the rest is below the surface. Mediation scholar Andrew Auckland draws a parallel between our narrative and the iceberg. He says the facts are the top of the iceberg, the portion that we see above the water. And then below the water, we divide the iceberg into 2 pieces. The first layer below the water, the middle layer of the iceberg, represents the individual's interests and values, or what a person tells us why a position is important from their perspective. And the bottom of the iceberg, the deepest part in the water, is what drives or motivates us. This portion includes our individual needs, our fears, anxieties, concerns, and our worries. And all of these layers link together to form the narrative we craft or that we adopt, though we may only share a small portion with the rest of the world. So now we consider the role of science in our debate on climate and the economy. If we focused our conversations on scientific data or facts in the narrative, we are missing an opportunity to understand the interests, needs, fears, and motivations that underpin those positions. As policy analysts, we need to leave our comfortable world of facts and data and recognize the murky world of emotions and values, and that it holds insights for us. So in our third case study, we examined the issue of Western alienation. And at the time that we held this discussion, Jason Kenney's Fair Deal panel had just released its paper. Sentiment in Alberta and Saskatchewan demonstrated a potential departure from the shared Canadian narrative, and the referendum on Section 36 of the Constitution Act provided an example of a willingness to a lack of a willingness, to comply with one of Canada's federal laws. So one of the driving motivations we saw, or deep emotions we saw in Western alienation, was a decline in trust. Yet we live in a democratic society that depends on trust, on a willingness to comply with laws and regulations, and to participate in the democratic process, for example, by voting. So without trust, our democratic process is really unable to function. And so when we don't have trust, it's important to enter into a dialogue to endeavor to find shared values and to rebuild trust. And so how do we do this when trust is low or non-existent? So we suggest that this could be done with empathy and with a rules-based approach to stakeholder engagement. Excuse me. Empathy is a gateway into another person's perspective or experience. And I'll give you the short version of empathy, because that could be another conversation in itself. But important to understand that empathy is not sympathy. It's not compassion. It's not emotional. It's the ability to recognize, understand, and respond to the feelings of another, the ability to suspend our own judgment and to listen to what someone is telling us, to acknowledge that they are bringing us their perspective, their narrative, which has been informed by their lived experiences, relationships, emotions, and also is informed by their fears and their needs. Empathy in a public policy context offers us a way to improve our understanding and engagement with citizens who may not share our perspectives, but in the context of public policy work, allows us to deliver on those values of respect for democracy, respect for people, integrity, stewardship, and excellence, which are at the core of our public service. The more we're able to listen to people whom we believe have nothing in common with us, the more likely we are able to find something in common. And so if we acknowledge that that we can use empathy to find commonality, we suggested that maybe one way to do this when there is no trust is to introduce a rules-based approach to dialogue. And very simply put, a rules-based approach is really identifying 3 or 4 very simple rules that everyone in a deliberative or engagement process would follow to introduce a notion of equilibrium and equality into the discussion. And that as those rules are enforced and observed, that we slowly are able to build trust. And I think, one key thing we took away from the project is that this process would then allow us to identify commonalities and to build a shared narrative. And importantly, building a shared narrative allows us to reframe the policy discussion starting from a place of where we have commonality, as opposed to a traditional debate process, which has a deficit model at its foundation, because it implies that in order to find commonality, that one party needs to give up more than the other. Where building a shared narrative begins from a place of what do we have in common? What can we agree on? So very briefly then, in the interest of time, I'll just share with you the recommendations that will be discussed in greater detail in the paper released later this week. So we identified 3 recommendations that focus on the process of policy development. The first one is in the area of consultation. So we offer that consultation processes be replaced or be supplemented by this idea of a rules-based deliberative process that gives all participants meaningful voice in the discussion. And those rules might be something like ensuring that everyone listens to the views of another, that participants be willing to acknowledge, review, and consider their own preconceived ideas, and that we seek commonalities among different perspectives, as well that we work fairly to accommodate those perspectives. Our second recommendation falls in the area of policy analysis and development. We propose that a shared narrative is an important tool for policy analysis and development, and that it could generate new understanding, helping policy analysts frame issues and develop options for consideration, perhaps through the form of the adoption of a consensus scan or another analytical tool that would map narratives and reframe public policy challenges by highlighting the issues, where Canadians have points of commonality, and where competing values are held by stakeholders. The third process recommendation is in the area of communications. And this is perhaps the most challenging of all steps, because in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of social media platforms and the introduction of a 24-hour news cycle that has created a world where news never stops and where the media cycle rewards hype. Yet complex policy challenges require time, analysis, deliberation, and collaboration. And that the communication of policy programs or services based on shared narratives provides us with an opportunity to frame messages in terms of an open and inclusive process, to discuss trade-offs, and to demonstrate the process behind the decision. In practical terms, this is a real change in the communication style and might require a culture shift in media communications, which obviously is greater than the work of one individual team or department. But we offer this in the context of understanding that we do need more transparency around the public policy process and to engender a tone that is more collaborative and constructive than the defensive tone we commonly find in the current political media landscape. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rhonda. What a terrific project. I had opportunity to engage in one aspect of that project and was just so impressed with the depth of the approach and all of the really well thought out background to each of the sessions. I think we'll all be looking forward to that report being released, and thank you so much for the sneak peek of the recommendations. I've no doubt we'll want to discuss them in the moderated discussion and Q&A. So I see that we've already got some questions coming in the moderated Q&A. I encourage you to pose your questions as we go. We're not going to open it up until Q&A until after all of the panelists have delivered their opening remarks. But please don't hesitate to throw in your questions, and we'll make sure to do our best to get to as many of them as possible in the Q&A session. So it now gives me great pleasure to invite Preston Manning to the virtual stage. Preston, you've lived these issues not only as somebody who thinks very deeply and seriously about them, but also as somebody who has practiced in polarized political spaces. So we are so delighted to have you with us today and really looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, and congratulations too to the Canadian Science Policy Conference. I think I went to the first one, which was 12, 13 years ago, and there was 100 people participated, and to see how this has grown and the breadth of participation is just a real tribute to the people that have organized this thing. I just have a couple of preliminary remarks, and I come at these questions more from the political standpoint. And the first is to make the point, and I guess it's obvious, that the polarization politics is not really healthy from a democratic process. It's divisive. It prevents consensus building. It makes governance, because ultimately governance is about the reconciliation of conflicting interests by non-coercive means, and polarized environments makes governance itself difficult. And I think it ultimately contributes to declining public confidence in democratic processes, elections, institutions. And we've seen that in Canada, the increasing number of people that are disillusioned with the political process and therefore don't participate in it. And then secondly, because I know a lot of our audience here today are people from the science community, I make the point that polarization is not in the interests of science either, that it treats science, scientific opinion, scientists as basically tools for partisan warfare. And it therefore corrupts the application of science to public policy issues and decisions, and can lead both to the misuse of science on the one hand and science denial on the other. So I'm just basically making the point that polarization is not good for democracy and the political process, and it's not good for the science community, which is really even why this panel exists. So the basic question, and I guess this is what we're all trying to deal with, is is what, and I want to particularly come at it from this angle, what can the science community do to contribute to policy and decision making without being co-opted by polarizers, and to advance the perspectives of science in the political arena. And just a couple of suggestions here. The first one is for scientists to understand and resist the tactics of those who simply want to secure your support for partisan purposes. And that involves resisting giving the impression that you are easily bribable. Because this is a very common view among political strategists and political activists, that the way you get support from the science community is just promise them more money for whatever their research or their project is. And if the only contact a politician has had has been with a science project or a science community that's asking for more money, you can see where they get that. So I think one wants to resist being positioned that way. And that can involve establishing and maintaining working relationships with the political community on a broader ground than just looking for money. And one of the ways of doing that is often when a scientist used to come and see me as a member of parliament, the first thing I'd say is, we've got this project, we need federal government funding for it, what can you do to help us? And eventually that's a legitimate thing to say. But it would be better if when you went to see the politician, you said, what is the main thing that is concerning you these days? What's the main thing that's worrying your colleagues and your constituents? And is there anything science can do to maybe inform that decision or help you? It's sort of starting where the political person is rather than the other way around. And then eventually get around to the raising the money, but maybe not start at that point. A second thing is not just to focus on the governing party, because often the party that's in opposition is going to be the government the next day. So a cross-partisan approach. And I also encourage both my academic and scientific friends, don't use this word non-partisan all the time, because the political arena, whether we like it or not, is intensely partisan. And when you say you're non-partisan, it sort of puts you in some different world that politician doesn't hardly recognize. But better, and I notice even in the presentations here today, people have used this word cross-partisan. What you're trying to say when you say you're non-partisan, you've got to say we're not in the pocket of any one of these parties. But cross-partisans is a better way to say, look, we're going to present our science to whoever you are, no matter what your party connections are, and it establishes a better relationship. And then there's another whole subject here that I'll just raise because we can maybe get into it in the discussion. I think it would help this relationship between the science community and the political community if scientists learned how to put their messages in their politically communicable form, as distinct from the form with which you communicate with your fellow scientists. Because when you're talking to the political person, and this is the way the media dominates this business today, that politician is thinking, if I step outside this room and that CTV or CBC lady sticks her mic and her camera in my face, can I explain to her what I just heard from this scientist? And if the politician can't figure out how to do that, literally within 50 seconds, then that communication is in trouble. Sorry about that. There was an interference from the outside. So those are kind of a few suggestions in that area of the relationship between the science and political communities. And then a second suggestion I'd have is for the science community to develop and put forward your own competent, politically unaligned spokespersons for your science, rather than allowing the politician to become the main communicator of your science on the issue, or the media becoming the main communicator, or somebody that the politician nominates because they like the way they present the issue from their perspective. And I think what this involves is encouraging and supporting a few competent members from the science community to seek public office or to join political offices. In our current parliament, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of members of parliament that actually have a significant scientific background, particularly in the natural sciences, chemistry, physics, mathematics, and biology. And I know this sounds like it's interrupting someone's political career, but maybe someone that's near retirement, but has a genuine scientific background, taking the time to become involved. It would only take a couple of genuine science people in each of the party caucuses to raise the knowledge and consciousness of what science can contribute to policy making. But at present, again, in the current parliament, among political staffs, you will find very, very few people with a genuine science background, particularly in the natural sciences. And I think that's something that needs to be remedied. I've been involved in candidate recruitment my entire life, and I do have to say that often people from the science community are the hardest ones to persuade to participate in that process. And then maybe the last thing I'll mention is just a shameless commercial. I have put out a book recently called Do Something, and it's aimed more at the political class, but I do have a chapter in it aimed at how can you strengthen relations between the political community and the science community. And there's a number of other suggestions along this line that might be helpful in bridging this gap. So that's probably enough from me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Preston. I think we're so lucky at CSPC to have someone like you with the background and experience that you do, who can do that sort of that translation work between the world of science and the world of politics, and come forward with some, very concrete recommendations that I'm really going to look forward to digging into a little bit more in the discussion session of the panel. So thanks very much for that. So our next speaker is Niilo Edwards, who, as I mentioned, I've had the pleasure of coming to get to know. Niilo is the executive director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which is it's a young organization, but I cannot imagine how they've managed to get so much done in such a short time. A tremendous capacity building work with First Nations communities that Niilo, I'm sure, will be getting into in his remarks. So Niilo, so delighted to have you with us here today. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, what your perspective is on these issues of polarization. Oh, you're on mute, Niilo.
I told myself I wouldn't do that, but yet here we are. Thanks, Monica, for having me as part of this panel, and nice to be recognized at this conference. This is our second time. I'm following in the footsteps of my colleague who was here with Monica last year. So nice to have that again. Before I begin, just want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations this morning. My comments will focus on the perspectives that I have gained as working as Executive Director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition in service to our members. Our organization is mandated to support the needs of our member First Nations in making informed business decisions concerning resource development within their traditional territories. Despite being engaged in support of our members on a number of major projects across Canada, our organization is project agnostic, meaning we don't take a position for or against a particular industry. And I think in the context of polarization, that has certainly served us well to be impartial. And this has really enabled our organization to be regarded as an honest broker of information. We have a reasonably good reputation as being an independent voice of sound business information. And we've been able to establish a considerable amount of trust amongst our membership for the services that we provide. I think this is a critical point as we look at the issue of polarization within Indigenous communities in relation to the resource projects that impact their lands. Historically, due to a lack of resources to support robust governance and decision-making processes, Indigenous communities, even today, struggle to obtain full and independent information concerning projects proposed for their territories, and to be able to make informed business decisions, often within tight regulatory timelines. There's often been cases where our members have been approached by multiple project proponents saying, we need you to weigh in on how this project impacts your territories. The project proponent and the government regulator proceed to provide stacks and stacks of documents to First Nations who may have not even a full-time staff person in their lands department who's capable of going through these documents, and then has to go consult with membership and chief and council to arrive at an informed decision in 30 days or less, using very limited financial resources in order to do it. So this really puts Indigenous communities in a position of having to make major decisions without the proper capacity support in place, and that can lead to the development of polarization among community members and decision makers within Indigenous communities when there isn't the ability to get all the facts on the table, and there isn't the ability to hold the type of community information processes that lead to the creation of scenarios where the community can actually see their values reflected back at them in project development. And by and large, I think this gap is what we're facing here in this country when we see projects being delayed due to court challenges or regulatory delays. It's ultimately a lack of information, lack of capacity, and lack of governance that is driving these situations the majority of the time. And you know, so when you don't have all the facts on a new project or have a lack of trust in the data, you know, for decision makers in smaller communities, it's often thought safer to reject the idea than it is to embrace it. Conversely, when a community is presented with a significant economic opportunity through a major project, it can be tempting to say yes at all costs, particularly for communities with huge socioeconomic deficits. And you know, that's a terrible position to be put in when you're trying to weigh your economic need against your community values. A lack of information really, again, puts community leadership in a tough spot and opens the door to polarization. Through the work of our organization, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, we're working directly with our members on strategies to build their internal community decision-making capacity concerning major projects. Good projects, in our view, are those where both the Indigenous community and the proponents' objectives can be met in a collaborative way that results in a meaningful partnership. These meaningful partnerships are not arrived at overnight. They take some time to achieve. But I can certainly say that you know, taking the time to do it right in the end really does create a value proposition for a proponent's bottom line to avoid the risk and the pitfalls of having projects held up in regulatory delays. And it also increases the economic value and maximizes the benefits for the participation of the Indigenous community at the same time. So what we do to support that is we go in and work with the community to develop decision-making models such as corporate structures and benefit sharing arrangements that fit the need of the particular project. We also work with our members to ensure that they are properly supported to represent their project interests during the regulatory phase. And there's a lot of science behind that. My colleagues that lead our environmental work do a lot of fact-based analysis, rely on a lot of science when it comes to land use planning and navigation through the impact assessment process here federally and at the provincial levels. So we've actually designed a process whereby Indigenous communities can lead their own impact assessment of projects based on their own set of data and reflecting their traditional values and cultural values. So our members see themselves as being good partners in achieving projects that reflect their community values and provide meaningful economic returns. And ultimately, when it comes down to when you have proper decision-making and governance structures and access to the data that you need to make informed decisions at the community level, you're therefore able to make inclusive and well-informed decisions. And I think Canada, the government of Canada in particular, needs to continue to make strategic investments in the capacity of Indigenous communities if we are going to see the change in the current narrative around the historic polarization we have seen between Indigenous communities and resource development proponents. And I do not believe we will have achieved our full potential as a country until such time as Indigenous communities are included as full and meaningful partners in the economy of Canada. So thanks very much for listening to my presentation. I really look forward to the discussion here today.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Niilo, every time I hear you speak, I learn something new that you are doing as an organization. It's so impressive. I wasn't aware of that work with the Impact Agency and Indigenous-led impact assessments. That's phenomenal. So we're going to move now into a moderated discussion session. So through the, oh, look at that. I didn't even have to ask. There, all of our panelists are here. This is terrific. And I will just note, it would appear, unfortunately, that Rachel Bitecofer, we were so excited to hear from her, but due to unfortunate technical difficulties, it looks like she won't be able to join us today. If she is able to come in last minute, we will definitely make some space for her. But for the moment, I think we have more than enough here, based on what we've heard so far, to have a great discussion. So I want to move to the questions that people have posed sooner rather than later. But maybe before getting to that, just to, maybe to hear a few words from each of you. One of the things that I think is woven in all of your remarks is that, we really need to do decision-making differently in an environment that is either polarized or fragmented or prone to polarization and fragmentation. And so we've heard about the importance of building trust, about the importance of capacity building, about the importance of listening before speaking, about the importance of communicating carefully using the right language. And thanks for the pro tip, Preston, about not saying nonpartisan. That's duly noted. We've heard about the importance of inclusive approaches, about the development of partnerships. This is potentially means very substantial changes to the way that we're making decisions. And I guess what I'd love to hear the panel on is sort of, where do you see the key changes that need to be made, and sort of who needs to be making those key changes? I'm really inspired, and Niilo, I'm such a big fan of the FNMPC, but I'm so inspired by the FNMPC's work because, here was a group of chiefs from a variety of First Nations that came together and said, we need to do things differently and create this structure to kind of help us deal with these challenges. Sort of who needs to be making change here? What are the key changes that need to be made? If you had to identify one thing, each of the panelists, and then sort of who should be working together to make that change, what would it be? And maybe we'll go in reverse order of the speakers. So Niilo, that would mean starting with you.
Thanks. Monica, as you know, I think we're all about collaboration here, and the important thing for us is to, in making changes that need to happen, is to bring all participants and stakeholders together as much as possible for an informed discussion. We're working on multiple levels here to change some of the systemic barriers that our members face in making informed decisions. This gets down to some of the policy mandates that are in place within government that haven't changed and adapted with societal and really case law changes in favor of Indigenous communities in particular, to support the integration of their interests into the Canadian economy. So in everything that we're doing, and Monica, you're involved in some of this with us, we are reaching out to other collaborators across the country because, you know, we can't do this on our own. And I think that goes, you know, that's a good rule of thumb for really anyone when you're working on a massive project is, you know, you're only going to get so far on your own. And to be able to work with others in academia, in science, in business and government to move the systemic change that we need to see is the right way to go.
Yeah, and some of it too, you know, and Niilo and others have mentioned this as well, this issue of time. You know, it makes me think of that, you know, when many of us were kids, we probably, you know, the little fable about the tortoise and the hare, you know, and sometimes moving fast doesn't necessarily mean moving effectively or in a durable fashion, but many of our institutions and sort of processes for decision making aren't necessarily set up to incorporate the time that's needed to build those lasting, durable, productive partnerships. That I think is one of, you know, also a challenge related to some of the issues that you've noted, Niilo. Preston, what's your sense?
Well, one perspective it's not represented on our panel, but it may be among some of the people that are watching that I think needs to be analyzed in relation to its impact on polarization is the role of the mass media. That in the media business, controversy is more newsworthy than harmony. Negative is more newsworthy than positive. Emotion-laden messages and actions are more newsworthy than fact-based or scientific-based input. And I think the mass media has an enormous role in facilitating polarization, or maybe there's some way of performing that doesn't do that. And at some point in this discussion on polarization, getting the media, and you know, media people argue that's the nature of our business. You know, you can come forward to me with a harmonizing, positive thing, and our system won't amplify it. In fact, it'll filter it out before it even gets to the editor. Mm-hmm. So that discussion, and it is too bad that our colleague from the U.S. couldn't be here, because I think this last election in the United States, many people say this was not a contest between Democrats and Republicans. This was a contest between the media candidate and a populist. A completely different, with the media actually being the one of the participants, not a reporting on it. So I think examining the role of the media, I don't have the answers to it, but examining the role of the media in either facilitating cooperation or encouraging polarization would be a worthwhile discussion to have.
Oh, what an interesting idea! And in fact, when we were first structuring the panel, we did have, you know, sort of that on our list as a perspective we wanted to bring. It's always challenging. There's only so many so many spaces, unfortunately. But absolutely agreed. And you know, I think your remarks focus predominantly on traditional media, but social media,
it's just some
of that on steroids, right? Echo chambers and the like. So absolutely, that's a key issue area. Rhonda, what about you? What's your perspective on this?
I'd like to unmute myself first, and then I'd like to build on the comments of the first two panelists, because I think that there's an intersection here between time and how we communicate, and maybe we could do with a with a bit of humility as well, because a lot of the polarizing topics that we're discussing are really complicated and they do require time, and we are not experts in many of these areas. And so, I agree with Preston's comments around the way that mass media amplifies hyped messages. And to that point, there's some really interesting research at Concordia right now by David Secco and Christina Sanza, looking at how we are attracted to hype and how people believe hyped messages perhaps more willingly than messages that are not hyped. So, in some ways, our own brains are our biggest challenges. But and I don't know who's responsible for this, but working towards an idea where we have more nuanced conversations about policy topics, where we're willing to take the time required to let people explain things to us, but also that big projects like what Niilo is working on, these take years. So can we teach ourselves a bit of humility and patience to allow those things to take the time they need? I think it's unrealistic to, shoehorn things into political electorate cycles. Certainly a lot of scientific work takes decades, not 4 years.
Yeah, very sage comments. So we're going to start to turn to the Q&A. So I'd encourage people to.
Monica, just before you do that, maybe you can pick up on something that Rhonda said there. This importance of humility. I think this is actually something the science community itself can demonstrate a little bit. Often when you're trying to soften someone else's position, one of the ways to start is say, I sure hope you don't make the mistakes that I made. It's a way we're actually talking about the other guy's mistakes, but you open the conversation by, I hope you don't, we made some mistakes and I hope you don't. And one of the things, like, there has been polarization in the science community. There was enormous polarization over whether light is a particle or a wave. And if you read some of the papers that were done on it, attacking each other, it almost sounded like the House of Commons. And science can make mistakes. It was for decades and decades, the science community believed there was such a thing as luminiferous ether that sort of permeated everything and explained how light worked, but nobody could find this ether. And I think in the science community, even approaching political people, saying, look, we've had our own polarization problems, but here's how we handled them. Or we've been wrong too, and we had to change our mind. Sort of that, just picking up on your use of words there, Rhonda, if humility is a way to communicate with other people, and if it's there, you get further than if you come, look, we know we have all the answers, and let us share them with you. Okay, so sorry to interrupt that way, Monica.
Not at all, Preston. It was a really great point, and certainly something that we've seen in our work as well is, sort of how do you make that shift from a commitment to being right, which many of us innately have, and and certainly in the science community, in the academic community, it's called for example, it's called a thesis defense for a reason. You're defending your research, right? We're quite used to defending being right. And how do you move from a commitment to being right to a commitment to being open? Or I don't know what the right terminology is there, but it is a bit of a paradigm shift, because if a lot of this is about building those relationships and building trust, charging in, assuming that you've got all the answers isn't necessarily the best way to build a relationship. Any other comments from the panelists then before we move to Q&A on anything we've heard so far?
I think just really quickly, I love what Preston was saying about the scientific, and also you, Monica, about this notion of defending ideas and the ongoing debate that we are so used to inside science. And I'm sure COVID will come up in the Q&A, but and I think actually it was a member of ISSP, Jake Berkowitz, who wrote this fantastic op-ed around how COVID is not only shedding light on all sorts of social problems and health problems, but it's also shedding light on the scientific process. And while I appreciate there are, a lot of barriers and challenges to science, I think it's interesting that we are undertaking a process to find a treatment for COVID, and also giving a really good example of illustrating the scientific process to non-scientists, which is in many ways, a search for knowledge.
Yeah. Niilo, any final comments from you before we turn to Q&A?
No, not really. I think I would just echo, the comments around humility, and humility has really served us well in the work that we're doing, and it helps to establish trust. It disarms people that may be predisposed to thinking that you've got all the answers. And on big projects, there isn't any one individual that can lead the day. It's a collective effort.
Great. All right, so I've opened up the Q&A section here. We've got lots of questions and the wonderful ability that folks have to vote questions up and down. So I'm just going to move from top to bottom here, and we'll see how far we get before we have to close off. So the first question, so let's start with a really easy one, people. Is it possible to reverse polarization on a scientific issue? I will open that up to the panel, and maybe Preston, if you're open to taking a cut at that one, given the nature of your remarks and the work that you've done. What's your sense?
Well, I think it is. You ended up your presentation by saying you were optimistic, and so I think an optimistic perspective is one that says this problem can be dealt with. There is a definition of a Canadian optimist is someone who thinks things could be worse, which I don't share that perspective. I actually think they could be better. But I do think you're not going to deal with polarization until it's recognized as a problem rather than as a tool to be exploited. And secondly, an effort made by people who believe, both in the science community and the political community, that polarization is dangerous, doing something to try to move toward a more cooperative model. Then recognizing the problem is usually the first step to at least a search for a solution.
Well, what's your sense, Preston? And I'm going to keep you on the hot seat if that's okay. But you mentioned in your response recognition of that polarization is a problem, and you included in that recognition within the political community. What's your sense in the political community? I mean, we've sat down in our work with party strategists who say, yeah, I mean, that's what we do. That's how you win an election. You try to polarize things and go after as many votes as you can.
I can tell you a story, a narrative about this. My father was Premier of Alberta from 1943 to 1968. During that period, W.A.C. Bennett was the Premier of your province there, Niilo, of British Columbia. Remember, W.A.C. Bennett, Wacky Bennett, they called him. And BC has been more polarized politics than any other province, in my judgment, of the country. It's got historical reasons. And Wacky Bennett used to say he couldn't change the polarization in BC, so you had to learn how to win in that environment. And he used to have this debate with my father. And he said, the way you win is sometimes you even deliberately do things that polarize it. But however you polarize, there's a mushy bunch in the middle. And the key to winning an election in a polarized environment is to get the mushy bunch in the middle to fall on your side of the fence instead of the other guy's side of the fence. So my father used to listen to Wacky on all this and say, yeah, but Wacky, there's one problem with that. If you polarize and polarize and polarize, eventually you will be replaced by your polar opposite, who will spend all his time undoing all the stuff that you did. And lo and behold, that is what happened to Wacky Bennett. He was replaced by Dave Barrett, who was only Premier for 3 years, but spent almost all his time undoing everything that Wacky had done. So my father's view, and this was more the Alberta perspective, if you're the governing party, and you can shape the political environment more than anybody else, you spend your time trying to turn your opposition into a pale imitation of yourself. You don't want them to win, but eventually, if they do win, you're not replaced by your polar opposite, by somebody that's going to undo everything you did. And of course, the story of Alberta was a social credit regime was a conservative party for 30 years, and it was replaced not by its polar opposite, but by the Lougheed conservatives, which were kind of they were conservative. But you see what that dealing with trying to get the political people to recognize there is a danger, even straight from your crass political interests. There's a danger in that polarization option because you'll ultimately undo everything you did.
But again, it comes back to taking a short versus a long term.
Yeah. And this trying to make your opposition see more of your own position is actually more, it's trying to find common ground rather than trying to divide yourselves on every conceivable point. And that's one tactic that the political people can use if you're worried about the ultimate dangers of polarization.
Great. Thank you for that. So I'm going to read the question again because it's been a bit of time here for Niilo and for Rhonda to weigh in. So the question is, how does is it possible to reverse polarization on a scientific issue?
So I think it is possible, and I would come back to this idea of the shared narrative where, if in my presentation I talked about the difference between a traditional debate and building a shared narrative is working from a place of where we have commonality. Mm-hmm. So we might be polarized on the prioritization of the environment over the economy, for example, but we can all agree that we want, a clean environment for our grandchildren. And so can we start there from a place of commonality, or we all agree that that people should be able to choose their place and type of employment. Mm-hmm. So I think it is possible, but it requires some reframing on our part.
Yeah, no, and I'd be really interested, Niilo, to hear your perspective on this, because certainly from an Indigenous perspective, science itself can be, laden with a whole series of I don't know, call it baggage or call it considerations. What's your perspective on this question?
Well, sure, I'll get to that, but I think it's important to note that our members, our Indigenous people, have based their own existence on their own set of science-based principles when it comes to Indigenous traditional knowledge and cultural values. There's our members know the land. They identify with it. It is their being. There's a lot of science, cultural science, if you will, around that. So, it's not difficult when you start to reflect those values back at communities to get to a point where people start to see themselves in the issue. And I think that's where we've been successful, is being able to take commercial opportunities through a process that we have and match the commonalities within those opportunities up with the traditional knowledge and the values of communities, using a process-based or loosely a science-based approach. And I think when people have the opportunity to sit down and really go through the details of what's being presented to them and understand each and every facet of the inner workings of what they're being asked to deal with, there's a level of comfort there in the decisions that would otherwise be absent. And we've been able to, I've seen in the last, the coalition's officially been around about 5 years, but we've been working on this about 8.5 to 9 years. And over that course of time, there's been a tremendous development amongst our members in their ability to work together, to convene meetings on a business or fact-based approach, and to separate the politics from the business. And I think the separation of politics from business is an important aspect in dealing with the whole issue of polarization in and of itself.
Good. That's good.
Yeah, no, lots in there, Niilo, and I think that, sort of the issue of meeting people where they're at and starting from their values, the importance of that, I think, is quite common to Rhonda's response as well. So we have another question that's now risen to the top, which is how does polarization affect public trust in institutions like science? Might polarization be manageable if we retain trust in science and expertise? So this is a question around polarization and trust in institutions with a particular lens on science. Who would want to weigh in on that?
Well, I mean, I can, or go ahead, Rhonda. Why don't you take a whack, and I'll take a whack later.
Okay, sorry about that. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Okay. So this is something we looked at in our project as well, is the difference between trust in an individual and trust in an institution. And I mean, you won't be surprised that that they kind of come down to the same thing, which is the idea of, is there a common or consistent approach to addressing problems, to dealing with issues by the institution as like we look for in individuals. We trust individuals because we rely on them to be consistent in their treatment of us or their treatment of issues. And fundamentally, we look for the same thing in institutions, except that an institution contains dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. And so the challenge becomes some sort of common approach or process internally that enables us to see a common output from that organization or institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think this is a much broader problem than just from a science standpoint. This declining public confidence in elections, in political institutions, is a huge thing, and it's spread right across the spectrum. Like in the what has there been, about 9 general elections, provincial and federal, in Canada since the year 2000. The voter turnout in those elections is 10% less, despite all the technology and the stuff to try to get people to vote, is about 10% less than it was the 8 or 9 elections at the last part of the 20th century. This recent BC election, the lowest voter turnout in the history of the province, 52%. We were talking about this earlier, Monica. The government got 44%, but that means only 23% of the BC electorate endorsed or supported the government. So this is a bigger problem, this how to restore confidence in the democratic processes, elections, political decision makers, than just its impact on the science side.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I've observed over the last few years that I think is a bit troubling is that it's not just about the declining trust, and certainly there's evidence to support that, over time, over the last number of decades. But if you look at the last few years' results of the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's less about declining trust and more about trust in flux. Right, like who or what people trust and with what level of commitment, it seems quite unstable over the last few years. So we went from, there was kind of a resurgence of trust in experts, and then I think it was the following year, people were more interested in terms of their trust. They were placing it more in the relationships within their control, notably with their employers. We've seen, changes in terms of trust too, once it starts to get unpacked, between the trust that the mass public, so to speak, has in institutions versus the informed public, and those splits, I think, are really interesting and important to look at. One of the things that certainly has emerged in our work on this is that when you talk about these issues from a broad systems perspective, it can become quite quickly, despairing. But if you start looking at well, what's in your control in particular areas of public policy? Where do the gaps seem to be? What are the institutions that can work on building their relationships? There it starts to get a little bit more tractable. Yeah. And I think about, whether it's the work that IOG has done recently, that project, or the work of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, or others, you start to see a few more kind of bright lights in how do you actually address these issues. Niilo, do you have some comments on this question as well? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I should stop doing that. But our members, there's an inherent lack of trust based on I hate to say it, but the history of Canada. I mean, they've been marginalized, disenfranchised by the actions of government since pre-Confederation. Really, how do you build trust with a sector of society that's just been, distrustful of everything that has happened to them for the last 200 or 300 years? The way that we have been successful in establishing our organization is it is Indigenous led. We've been successful at convincing our funders to support the development of a governance regime that is reflective of their priorities and that they can see themselves in it. It gets back to my earlier comments. And I think by and large, when you're trying to build trust with any sector of society, no matter who they are, they have to be able to see their values reflected back at them, and it can't be driven by personal self-interest. It can't be driven by the agenda of some other governing body or corporation. It's got to be a truly collaborative effort, and I think when it comes to the broader agenda with resource development in particular, that's a struggle point for the relationship between Indigenous communities and project proponents. Is the philosophy that the two entities arrive at a position is entirely different. You have Indigenous communities who are looking at it from a communal perspective, a holistic perspective, and then you have a private enterprise who are looking at it from a bottom line and strictly commercial perspective. So it's a bit of a balancing act to try and bridge the divide, so to speak. But it can be done through building the foundations of trust and being able to communicate effectively in such a way where both parties see themselves as benefiting from a mutually shared objective. And it takes time, it takes patience, but ultimately, if both parties are well supported in their objectives, it can be done, and we are seeing it with what we're doing.
That's great, and it actually, your comments open up so nicely to the next question that's jumped up to the top, which is a question about education and training. So I think that'll be near and dear to all of our hearts here on this panel. So the question reads, we talk about polarization at the political level or within society. What about the training of current policy analysts? Are our schools, faculties educating them too narrowly on the type of perspectives and solutions that exist out there? I think I'm just going to jump in and say yes to that question, but I'm going to open it up to the panel because I know that all of you in various ways either have been directly engaged in thinking about education and training and actually actively doing education and training. And others of you, I think, are in a position to maybe reflect upon what are some of the gaps. I certainly see it in the work that we do at the Institute and beyond. We need to think about training and development and education differently. I think if we're going to address some of these really important challenges that require a transformation in decision making and perspectives. So maybe, Rhonda, I'll start with you, seeing as you're coming from a training organization that I'm sure does some work directly with policy analysts. What's your perspective on this question?
Yeah, we definitely offer a lot of training at the IOG, and so the training that I'm involved in is really focused on the science and innovation aspects. So I mean, at the risk of making this commercial, but one thing that we are finding is that so Jeff Kinder and I have a program that is leadership development for people with research or technical backgrounds who are moving into executive level positions. And we structure the program, in three tranches. And the leadership one is really where we find participants are most keen to learn. And I don't want to say and where it's most foreign to their formal training. So this is where we're talking about getting into social leadership, emotional skills, leading teams, dealing with changes in the workplace, with really big, important topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, mental health, and it's clear that a lot of our through no fault of their own, but going through traditional education programs in chemistry or biology or physics, these are not topics they're exposed to, and some people in this have self-educated to the best of their abilities. But if you're in your 40s or 50s and this is the first time you're getting, formal exposure to this, I think that indicates a problem. And I'm not an expert, so I will just simply put a shout out to the Future Skills Center, because they've got a really interesting project examining need for what they're calling social and emotional skills. And I've had the privilege to listen to a couple of their presentations, and I think the work they're doing is fascinating.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think there have been some really interesting developments, certainly in the science policy community, whether it's the Canadian Science Policy Fellowship program or Science Outside the Lab North, or, other training programs. Are they doing enough to sensitize on these issues? I think that would, merit exploration. The other thing, certainly at the university, that we're looking at very closely is, to your point, Rhonda, in disciplinary programs, which is what most people still are in, particularly in the natural sciences and engineering, how do you create opportunities to develop those skills? And that can be, training opportunities, can be micro credentials, micro programs around things like science communication, policy making, and the like. And Niilo, what's your perspective on this? And feel free to weigh in wherever it makes sense, whether it's in the sort of formal educational sector or training that the FNMPC or others are doing. What's your sense?
Well, thanks, Monica. One of the more recent things that we're doing that we're quite proud of is our collaboration with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada on a 3-year training program to provide skills and knowledge to our members and really all Indigenous communities that want to take part in it, around navigating the new impact assessment regime at the federal level. So we are designing a series of briefings, both technical and I guess applied, if you will, for communities, targeted at the lands and resource managers and the technicians that work for Indigenous communities on strengthening their practices around impact assessment. Additionally, contracting and procurement opportunities around major projects, the skills training that need to be involved. Oftentimes, it's difficult for Indigenous communities to break into those arenas through skilled trades, and we're looking at strategies, actually working with a labor union right now on developing some targeted programming so that our members, when needed, can be deployed on the major projects that are being built within their territories and take pride in having a major chunk of that workforce being locally sourced. And, you know, getting back to some of the other issues we've been discussing on this panel, I think one of the aggravating factors of polarization around major project development and issues of trust comes down to where the components of these projects are being sourced. And we've seen a lot of instances, at least in our experiences, where local people have been turned away in favor of outsourcing these jobs to you know, people who are not familiar with the area, or whatever the case may be, in an effort to I guess save money. But in actual fact, what a lot of these strategies do is cause internal strife with the project, the relationship with the local communities, particularly the Indigenous communities. So I think in terms of jobs and training, we have to get smarter about how we approach an inclusive strategy around training local people in the areas where these projects are impactful, and ultimately, you know, supporting the local knowledge base in the economies. And I think a more holistic approach around that is what's needed as part of the answer to move things forward.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what about Niilo in terms of, you know, so that's a lot of focus on your members and community members of your members. What about on the part of whether it's industry proponents or government regulators or policy makers? You know, are there kind of gaps that need to be filled there as well in terms of their sensitization and awareness of the issues and you know, how to build those relationships?
Well, some of the systemic issues, I think, with the approach to this relates to how the regulations around it have been set up in the first place. And I think there hasn't been proper guidance from government or an uptake through incentives to the private sector to ensure that they are doing everything they can to maximize local economic spin-offs from jobs and training. And we certainly have some ideas around that. We are engaged with a couple of government departments at the provincial and federal level in designing what that could look like. But you know, I think there's certainly a role to play to improving these environments across the country, and it really does start with you know, what rules are in place and what kind of incentives are there for the private sector to actually want to create the change we need to see. Great.
Preston, we've got just a couple minutes left. What's your perspective on the training?
Well, I think there's enormous need for far better and more training for the political class. If you want them to do something other than play polarization politics, if you want them to be more receptive to the scientific, how to handle scientific information, if you want them to be more sensitive to Indigenous concerns, like to become a barista at Starbucks, you need 10 to 15 hours of training in order to know the difference between a mocha and a latte. You can become a lawmaker in the Parliament of Canada without 1 hour of training in lawmaking. You can become the MP for a constituency that's got 10 Aboriginal communities in it, and the political parties will not give you 1 hour of training in how to relate to these folks who are your constituents. And so there's an enormous need there. And I've been promoting this for years. This graduate program in political management in Carleton is one of the efforts to try to improve this. The Institute for Future Legislators, which is a summer school program at UBC, is an attempt to do this. And there is another proposal out at UBC to create a 100, called Democracy House, to create a 100-seat replica of the House of Commons, everything, media rooms, caucus rooms, chamber, etc., to do nothing but try to train the political class to deal with some of the things we're talking about here, how to relate to science, how to relate to the faith communities, how to relate to the Indigenous communities. And I just think that would be an enormously worthwhile investment to advance all the ideas that have been presented here.
Well, what a terrific note for us to end on. So I wish we could have gotten to all of the questions. I think we probably could have carried on for another few hours, but as it happens, we do need to wrap up the session in about a minute here. So I wanted to take an opportunity to begin by thanking our panelists. Fantastic job. This was extremely interesting and informative, and I truly hope that those who attended the session feel the same way, which brings me to those who attended the session. Thank you so much for attending today. I hope you'll take the time to fill the survey about the session and let us know what you thought, what your thoughts were, and don't hesitate to be in touch if need be. I'd also like to take the time to thank Brendan Frank, who's Senior Research Associate at the ISSP and did so much legwork to make this panel happen. Thank you, Brendan. I know you're out there watching somewhere. And then finally, I would like to thank the CSPC for selecting this panel to be part of this year's conference, for all the tremendous support. We're so delighted to be able to offer this session today, and would not have been able to do it without the CSPC. So thanks so much to the CSPC team.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, folks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.